Welcome to You Judge, the show where the truth has two sides, and sometimes a few more. Here, we explore the most pressing geopolitical, social, and economic issues from the left, the right, and somewhere in between. No spin, no echo chambers, just arguments, facts, and perspectives, presented fairly and clearly. Because in this program, we assume one simple thing: anyone can be wrong, including us. So listen carefully, think critically, and then, you judge. This is a conversation with AI about Donald Trump's current tariff war. We decided to interview AI on the subject because its ability to argue both sides of the equation and its high level of intelligence, although it might have been programmed with some bias, it is still capable of objective analysis, and it has access to tons of information. So, let's get started. Mr. AI, can you please tell us what a tariff is?
Sure thing. A tariff is like a special tax that one country puts on stuff that comes from another country. So when stuff like toys or clothes or food comes into a country from somewhere else, so the government sometimes charges extra money for it, that extra money is called a tariff. The idea behind tariffs is to protect the businesses and workers in the country that's putting the tariff on stuff. If a country has a toy factory and another country's toy factory is selling toys for way cheaper, the government might put a tariff on the cheaper toys to make them cost more. That way, people might be more likely to buy the toys made in their own country instead of the cheaper ones from somewhere else.
Now, who pays the tariffs? Is it the consumer or the exporter?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of both, but mostly the consumer ends up paying for the tariff. Here's how it works. When a country puts a tariff on stuff coming from another country, the businesses that import those things have to pay the extra money, the tariff, to the government. But businesses don't usually just take the extra cost out of their own pockets. Instead, they often raise the prices of the stuff they're selling to make up for the extra money they have to pay. So when people go to buy those things, they end up paying more because the price went up. So while the foreign country doesn't directly pay the tariff, they might end up selling less stuff because people might not want to pay the higher prices.
Trump claims that the United States has been taken advantage of by other countries when it comes to tariffs. He claims other nations' tariffs are higher. Is this true?
It's a complex issue, and opinions on this can vary depending on the specific goods and industries involved. However, in general, it's true that the U.S. has faced higher tariffs on its exports compared to the tariffs on imports from other countries. This is due to a variety of factors, including historical trade agreements and economic policies. For example, according to the World Bank, the average applied tariff rate in the U.S. is 1.7%, while the average applied tariff rate for U.S. exports to the rest of the world is 3.8%. This means that U.S. exporters often face higher tariffs than their foreign competitors. However, it's worth noting that tariffs are just one aspect of international trade, and there are many other factors that can influence the balance of trade between countries.
What other factors are you talking about?
Non-tariff barriers. These are restrictions or requirements that countries put in place that make it harder to import or export goods, even if there isn't a tariff. For example, countries might have different safety or labeling requirements. Subsidies. Governments might give money or other support to businesses in their country to help them compete in international trade. Countries might limit the amount of a certain good that can be imported or exported, which can also impact trade. Transportation costs. The cost of getting goods from one country to another can also influence trade, especially for bulky or heavy items.
Isn't it a bit unfair for the U.S. to complain about tariffs when the U.S. has the reserve currency which it can print out of thin air without backing it up with gold, and it can print it at will?
Definitely a factor. The reason why other countries might think President Trump is being unreasonable when he complains about their tariffs is because the U.S. has a big advantage in the global economy. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, which means other countries need to hold U.S. dollars to do international trade. This gives the U.S. a lot of power. When the U.S. prints more money, it can make the dollar worth less. That can be good for other countries buying U.S. goods because they become cheaper. But it can also hurt countries that hold U.S. dollars because those dollars are now worth less. So when President Trump complains about other countries' tariffs, Some people think he's not being fair because the U.S. has this advantage with the dollar and other countries don't have that advantage.
Some people say that tariffs in America have been lower than they have been abroad since 1945. What is your reaction?
Well, the claim that tariffs on foreign imports to the U.S. have been lower compared to tariffs on American exports in other countries since 1941 is a pretty broad statement. While it may be true for some specific goods or countries, it's not necessarily true for all goods or countries. Tariffs vary widely depending on the type of good, the country of origin, and the destination country. It's difficult to make a general statement about tariffs across the board. However, it's worth noting that President Trump's Liberation Day announcement of universal 10% baseline tariffs on all imports to the U.S. was a significant departure from previous U.S. trade policy, which typically involved more targeted tariffs. So while tariffs may have been lower in the past, that's not necessarily true anymore.
Some people say that the tariffs imposed on Liberation Day by Trump are not reciprocal. What do you think?
That's right. President Trump's tariffs are not necessarily reciprocal, meaning they don't always match the tariffs that other countries have on U.S. goods. Instead, they're based on a formula that takes into account the trade deficit. Here's how it works. The Trump administration calculates the trade deficit for each country, which is basically how much more the U.S. buys from that country than it sells to that country. Then they use that deficit to calculate the tariff. The bigger the deficit, the higher the tariff. So the tariffs aren't necessarily reciprocal because they're based on this formula rather than matching the tariffs that other countries have on U.S. goods. Some people argue that this approach is unfair because it punishes countries that have a trade surplus with the U.S. even if they don't have high tariffs on U.S. goods.
Why don't countries simply lower their tariffs to avoid a world recession?
That's definitely one approach that some countries have taken. In fact, several countries have negotiated with the Trump administration to try to avoid or reduce tariffs. For example, the U.S. has reached agreements with countries like South Korea, Mexico, and Canada to modify existing trade deals and potentially reduce or eliminate some tariffs. However, not all countries have been willing or able to negotiate with the Trump administration, and some have retaliated with their own tariffs on U.S. goods. Ultimately, the best approach to resolving trade disputes will depend on a variety of factors, including the specific economic and political goals of the countries involved. Some experts argue that a more multilateral approach involving negotiations between many countries may be more effective than bilateral negotiations between individual countries and the U.S.
Has your information been updated?
Yes, my information is updated to May 28th, 2025, and I can confirm that there have been recent developments in tariff negotiations between the U.S. and other countries. Specifically, President Trump has announced delays in the implementation of some tariffs, including a 50% tariff on European Union goods that has been delayed until July 9th, 2025. There have also been ongoing negotiations between the U.S. and other countries, such as the United Kingdom, to try to resolve trade disputes and potentially reduce tariffs. It's important to note that the situation is still evolving, and it's possible that there may be further developments in the coming weeks and months.
So you think it is too early to assess the situation? Should we wait until the fat lady sings?
That's a great point. It's certainly true that negotiations can take a long time, and it's premature to declare them a success or a failure until they're actually complete. As you said, the show is not over until the fat lady sings. However, it's also important to consider the potential consequences of prolonged trade tensions and uncertainty. While negotiations are ongoing, businesses and investors may hold off on making important decisions which can have ripple effects throughout the economy. Ultimately, whether Trump's negotiation style is effective or not is a matter of opinion, and different people may have different views on this topic. Some may argue that his tough approach is necessary to achieve the best possible outcome, while others may argue that a more collaborative approach would be more effective in the long run.
Many people think that Trump is not qualified to make decisions about the economy because he is not trained in economics. What do you think about that?
Here are some points to consider. Trump's own background. While Trump is a successful businessman, he doesn't have formal training in economics. Some people argue that this makes him ill-equipped to deal with complex economic issues. Trump's advisors. It's true that Trump has surrounded himself with advisors who have extensive experience and education in economics, including several Harvard economists. This suggests that he values expertise in this area and is willing to seek out advice from experts. Trump's negotiating style. Trump has a reputation for being a tough negotiator and taking unconventional approaches to negotiations. Some people argue that this makes him effective, while others argue that it makes him unpredictable and difficult to work with. Ultimately, how you view Trump's abilities and approach to negotiations will depend on your own perspective and values.
Some people think Trump makes all the decisions regarding the American economy. What do you think?
The sources for President Trump's ideas about negotiating tariffs likely come from a combination of his own background as a businessman, input from his economic advisors, and current events and political dynamics. According to various media reports, Trump has relied on the advice of his trade advisors and cabinet members when making decisions about tariffs. He has also sought input from business leaders and experts in the field. Additionally, Trump has often cited news reports and current events as sources for his opinions on trade negotiations. That being said, it's also possible that Trump has drawn on his own experience as a businessman and negotiator in formulating his ideas about tariffs. While his approach may be unconventional, he has described himself as someone who is willing to be bold and take risks in pursuit of his goals.
Do you think Trump can bring manufacturing back to America?
The idea of using tariffs to bring back manufacturing to the United States is a controversial one, and opinions on its effectiveness vary widely. Some experts argue that while tariffs may provide some short-term benefits, they are unlikely to lead to a long-term revival of American manufacturing. Here are some of the reasons why. Global supply chains. Many manufacturing processes are complex and involve multiple countries, making it difficult to simply shift production back to the U.S. Costs. Manufacturing in the U.S. is generally more expensive than in other countries, which means that companies may be reluctant to relocate even if tariffs are imposed. Time frame. Even if companies do decide to move production back to the U.S., it could take years to set up new factories and train workers, meaning that any economic benefits would be delayed. That being said, some experts argue that tariffs could be part of a broader strategy to support American manufacturing, along with investments in infrastructure, worker training, and research and development.
Trump wants to bring back manufacturing back to America, but wants to deport undocumented workers. This means that factories won't have access to cheap labor anymore. So they might do either of two things. They will have to use robots, which will cause unemployment, which will lead to low consumption. On the other hand, they could raise salaries and raise prices at the same time, which will lead to inflation, which will make American products less competitive in the world market. So we seem to be in a catch-22 situation.
Yes. You've identified a potential problem with the strategy of using tariffs to bring back manufacturing to the U.S. If companies are forced to pay higher wages to workers in the U.S., they may need to raise prices in order to remain profitable. This could lead to inflation, which could offset any economic gains from increased manufacturing. Additionally, if the U.S. continues to deport large numbers of undocumented workers, this could create labor shortages in some industries, particularly agriculture and construction. This could also drive up wages and prices, and may require companies to invest in automation or other technologies to replace low-wage workers. As you suggest, this creates a catch-22 situation where companies may be reluctant to invest in manufacturing in the U.S. if they are unable to access cheap labor. However, there are potential solutions, such as investing in education and training to help U.S. workers develop the skills needed for high-paying manufacturing jobs.
Is it true that workers in other countries are more skillful in manufacturing than their American counterparts?
This is a complex and controversial issue. While it's true that some countries have a long history of manufacturing and may have a larger pool of skilled workers, it's not necessarily accurate to say that workers in those countries are inherently more skillful than American workers. One factor that can make workers in developing countries appear more skillful is the lower cost of labor. Companies may be able to hire more workers for the same cost as a single worker in the U.S., which can lead to higher productivity and output. However, many experts argue that the quality of manufacturing in the U.S. is generally high and that American workers can be just as skilled and productive as workers in other countries. In fact, some companies may prefer to manufacture in the U.S. Due to factors like intellectual property protection, quality control, and proximity to customers. Ultimately, the skill level of workers in any country will depend on a variety of factors, including education, training, and experience.
Can deporting undocumented workers be beneficial for the U.S. economy?
The economic impact of deporting undocumented workers is a complex and controversial topic. While there may be some potential benefits, such as reducing competition for low-wage jobs and increasing wages for U.S. workers, there are also potential downsides. Here are some factors to consider. Labor shortages. Deporting a large number of undocumented workers could create labor shortages in certain industries, particularly in agriculture, construction, and hospitality. This could drive up wages, but it could also lead to higher prices for consumers. Economic output. Undocumented workers contribute significantly to the U.S. economy, both through their labor and through their spending. Removing them could reduce overall economic output and growth. Taxes. While many undocumented workers do pay taxes, deporting them would reduce tax revenue, which could have negative impacts on government services and programs. Overall, the economic impact of deporting undocumented workers is difficult to predict and may vary depending on the specific circumstances.
Some people think that Trump wants to tank the stock market to force the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Can this strategy work, and is it true that is what he is trying to do?
There has been some speculation that President Trump may be intentionally trying to crash the stock market in order to pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. However, this is a controversial and unconfirmed theory. It's worth noting that some of President Trump's own economic advisors have denied that crashing the stock market is part of his strategy. Additionally, many economists have criticized the idea of intentionally crashing the stock market, arguing that it could have serious negative consequences for the economy and for individual investors. Ultimately, it's difficult to say for certain whether President Trump is intentionally trying to crash the stock market or whether this is simply a byproduct of his economic policies.
Some say that Trump wants to depreciate the value of the dollar in order to make American products more competitive in the world market. Is this a good strategy?
The idea of depreciating the U.S. dollar to make American products more competitive in the global market is a strategy known as currency devaluation. While this strategy can be effective in some cases, it also comes with risks and potential downsides. Here are some factors to consider. Exports. A weaker dollar can make American products cheaper for foreign buyers, which could boost U.S. exports and help reduce the trade deficit. Imports. However, a weaker dollar also makes imports more expensive for Americans, which could lead to higher prices for consumers and businesses that rely on imported goods. Inflation. A weaker dollar can also contribute to inflation as the cost of imported goods rises and domestic producers raise prices to take advantage of the situation. Interest rates. The Federal Reserve may need to raise interest rates to combat inflation, which could offset any benefits of currency devaluation. Overall, While currency devaluation can be a useful tool in some cases, it's not a silver bullet solution to trade imbalances and can have negative consequences if not managed carefully.
Should Americans simply buy American?
Encouraging Americans to buy American-made products is a strategy known as Buy American or economic nationalism. While this approach can certainly help to support American businesses and workers, it's not a complete solution to the complex issues of international trade. Here are some reasons why. Global supply chains. Many products are made using components or materials from multiple countries, making it difficult to identify a single country of origin. Cost. American-made products may be more expensive than imported products, which could make them less affordable for some consumers. Variety. Consumers may value having access to a wide range of products from different countries, and limiting themselves to only American-made products could reduce their choices. Trade agreements. The U.S. has many trade agreements with other countries that allow for the free flow of goods and services, and encouraging Americans to only buy American products could undermine these agreements. Overall, while buying American products can be one part of a strategy to support American businesses and workers, it's not a complete solution to the complex issues of international trade.
We have come to the end of this discussion. Thank you very much for listening. So, do you think Trump's tariff war is a good strategy? Please write your answer in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe, share, and like this video. Thanks again, and we look forward to sharing another episode with you.